Hello friends, my name is Nizamuddin Ahmed Siddiqui and I am an assistant professor of law at West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, Kolkata. I will be taking this unit on Marxist theory of rights. This unit aims to fulfill certain learning objectives, which include: number 1, to understand the significant contribution of Marx on the origin and nature of society, capital formation, and its relation on the lives and rights of people and institutions and societies and nations. Number 2, to analyze the relevance of Marxist conception of communist or social democratic state as against liberal democratic state and present global economies. Marx was born in 1818 in Germany. In fact, he enrolled for law graduation in the Berlin University. But influenced by William Friedrich Hegel's philosophy, he pursued studies in philosophy. He was also influenced by French Revolution, socialist literature, and sought to journalism to impact industrial workers who are sufferers due to excess working hours and inhuman treatment. Because of his revolutionary journalism, he was expelled to live in Germany, moved to London. His impacting works, which include Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts 1844, Das Kapital and Critique of Gotha Program. Marx associated with Friedrich Engels in London, and their combined works such as German Ideology and Manifesto of the Communist Party too influenced socialistic thinking in London. Marx associated with Friedrich Engels in London, and their combined works such as German Ideology and Manifesto of the Communist Party too influenced socialistic thinking in London, Russia, and in Siberia in his times and all over the world even after his death. Marx lived in poverty, lost his children and wife due to poverty, and yet he continued to perform his social responsibility as journalist and fellow citizen to impart his ideas on human rights. For instance, Marx from his young school days aimed to seek such position from which he can uplift himself and others in society. Further, his pursuits continued though his own writings and also along his writings with Engels. Marx, despite his life in abject poverty, consciously struggled to find a classless society, a society without economic and other social alienations. To understand Marxist conception of rights, one must go through his views on the origin of society and man's development in various societies, namely agrarian, industrial, and modern civilizations. Also, how the process of production and capital formation led for inhuman human relations in society, and the need to examine these and revolt against, if necessary, to establish a social democratic society. Marx was born when nations were technically advanced, where mechanical forces entered human lives. Modern period, as we understand, is a period of scientific temper in the areas of philosophies too. Yet, science and rationalistic philosophy could not help human oppression of one economic or social class over the other. Marx and Engels, as said above, through their combined thinking aimed to change the society. To them, society is conceived on material development rather than on spiritual or ethical basis or even eternal laws or superstitious power. Their materialistic conception is named as dialectic materialism. According to this phenomena of dialectic materialism, every aspect needs to be studied in three levels: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Thesis is the original or existing state of the world, society, or anything. Things or human beings do interact when they are together. Hence, according to the second level of dialectic process, human beings through their interaction will come to know their relationship with each other in the positive or negative aspect. Once the things or beings in the dialectic process come to know the elements of growth or decay of beings and societies, there develops a conscious movement that grows and results into a new product. This final state, according to Marx and Engels, is synthesis. Marx applies the dialectical process for understanding economic and social relations of the state that determine man's status. Accordingly, Marx assumes a revolution due to the revolting power that is suppressed in the oppressed societies and nations against the socially and economically disadvantaged classes and nations, when all the nations united in a world of socialistic state, or which is called as a communist state in its higher sense. In fact, to Marx, each person or nation belongs to a proletariat class to serve another person or nation for its material existence. The dominant class is called the bourgeois class, according to Marx. The proletariat class is the oppressed one. Marx and Engels together worked through their writings, and mainly Engels studied the origin of family and private property. In the early agrarian societies, man is measured in terms of possession of cattle and land. When the agricultural asset and cattle assets determine the status of household in the family, the female household is in turn slave to the male household. Similarly, master-slave relationships are found in the family conception of human rights. Thus, all human relations according to Marx and Engels are related to monetary relations. Furthermore, while polygamy was the feature of primitive family, polygamy indicates the slave status of women. Early matriarchal families were termed as patriarchal, which is a prime slave society. Similar in the society based on the strength of cattle. Human cattle works in agricultural field, and the amount of money, the invention of coin money together all contributes for the accumulation of power in one person or a group of persons. Thus, private property determines the social stratification. And hence, there evolved two classes, proletariat class and bourgeois class. Accumulation of capital led to possession of private property. For example, in a family, the wife represents the proletariat and the husband the bourgeois. Similarly, in the agricultural production, the landlord represents the bourgeois and the worker represents the proletariat. In the industrial production, the proprietor is the bourgeois and the industrial worker of any category is the proletariat. This goes on between dominant groups over less developed groups. In fact, there is vicious circle as long as there is one dominant person or group against one oppressing person in human societies. If the oppressed does not introspect of his or their status and questions the statuses. Thus, the economic class is politically dominant also. What is the nature of labor and what are the features of working class? Civilizations of nations, however sophisticated they are not devoid of exploitation and alienation. As we understand social class formation, it is based on property relations. Some people exercise this monetary power to exploit the others. It is not a willing submission, but a necessary evil for the existence and for the livelihood. Marx contends that man becomes a commodity along with land and other goods necessary for production and running of an organization of society. For example, women's labor becomes a commodity for the existence of family. Workers' labor for production and administrative or other works become commodity as means of production. The nature of labor is well explained in the words of Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending class. Marx was firmly convinced that bourgeois class changes all human relations. The bourgeois has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborer. Thus, Marx contends that the entire middle class includes everybody, and law, morality are all the rules of the ruling class, and others are subjected to their rules. Marx was sensitive to the most part for the industrial workers who lived in poor working conditions and with lowly paid wages. However, his views on exploitation of laborer he further extends to all working places including domestic front. But he starts with lowly paid wages. In his Das Kapital, the producer, the laborer, is devoid of rights over the product he produces. The wages, according to Marx, are not justly paid. The value of labor is not actual value but an imaginary value that is created. Marx identifies the concept of surplus value involved in the unpaid labor of worker, due to which the employer accumulates capital consistently. While C stands for commodity and M stands for money, Marx says that the commodity involved in the labor of worker again transforms into money. This is represented as M, C and M. This surplus value is equal to unpaid labor that is due on the labor. This surplus value is equal to unpaid labor which is due upon the laborer. In this way, the capitalist accumulates capital and social and political power that hinders the growth of worker. This process is like agricultural laborers, where the landlord, whom Marx calls as feudal lord, acquires power to command over agricultural workers. Friends, alienation is the separation of a person from a thing or a possession or any right to human development. Such production leads to man's alienation from the produce and other types of alienations. The first alienation is related with the produce. The worker cannot avail the produce as much as he wants, whether it is industrial production or agricultural produce. Moreover, all the produce will be converted as private property for capitalist or industrialist or landlord or whoever it is. Second alienation is man, where he is alienated from his own activity, alienated from himself. Third alienation is from his species, from his own character. The fourth type of alienation is from other men. With low paid wages, the working class leads a miserable life, and the whole proletariat class suffers from psychological and social alienation. Politically, the labor is still poor, as the bourgeois class becomes also the ruling class and frames the convenient laws for its growth. Hence, natural man who is creative and enthusiastic becomes dull, loses his natural being in pre-industrial societies or agricultural societies, and this alienation is the root of man's mechanical life as worker. And one must always relate Marx's every phenomenon not simply to industrial working class, but to the entire gamut of global society. Marx felt sensitive initially with the industrial working class, but he tried to find the roots of human suffering. Hence, Marx aimed at such society where man lives as a natural man, devoid of artificial selection of occupation for his survival, and above all lives like free and amicable social being without his attachment to wages or money or produce. Marx constructs an ideal state to restore rights of not only the rights of disadvantaged hitherto, but a state for equality, justice, and common good. It is through the destruction of capitalist society, which only can encourage accumulation of capital at all levels in the name of right to private property. He builds a socialistic state. To Marx and Engels, democratic republic is the highest evolutionary form. They put forward 10 steps for the restoration of rights. Number 1, abolition of private property in land and application of land to public purpose. Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Number 3, abolition of rights of inheritance. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. Number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. Number 6, centralization of means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Number 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the population over the country. And number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc. The said state is not an outcome of a revolt through a dialectical process of social, economic, and political classes, a class struggle which is crucial to Marx. Marx envisions revolutions: capitalist revolutions, proletariat revolutions, and communist revolutions. In capitalist revolution, due to scientific advances, the number of producers increase and there would be competition between manufacturers. This is a stage where demand for labor too increases. Workers with wages would transform as salaried employed. In the proletariat revolution, the proletariat seizes the public power. In the proletariat revolution, the proletariat seizes the public power and the production of the bourgeois and transforms it as public property. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. And the struggle for individual existence disappears. Further, communist revolution is an outcome of proletariat revolution. Initially, it starts at national level, but extends to international level. Marx says, working men have no country. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeois, to the freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production, and in the conditions of corresponding thereto. Marx had influence while he was alive. In aftermath, he influenced peoples and nations too. There was tremendous impact of Marx, beginning from the progressive literature all over the world to all academic disciplines, namely law, sociology, politics, economics, and anthropology. He influenced Russian Revolution. It also impacted postmodern thinking and in the critique of liberal democracy that facilitated unruly free trade and indiscriminate rights in the name of individualism. There are umpteen numbers of people and institutions that can be rated to have Marxist goals and inclinations. Lenin in Russia, Mao in China, Lucas in Hungary, Gramsci in Italy, and Rosa Luxemburg were influenced by Marx. Lenin, like Marx, contends that there is no possibility of human rights until all possibility of the exploitation of one class by another has been totally destroyed. Further, Lenin remarks on democracies, there is no a single state, however democratic, which has no loopholes or reservations in its constitution guaranteeing the bourgeois. Mao liberated China from feudalism and drudgery of farmers. Peasant cooperatives and development of self-managed communities, self-regulatory systems are the changes brought into rural lives by Mao. Mao's new democratic postulates, joint democratic dictatorship, an alliance of revolutionary classes of the worker and based on most of the people. Thus, Mao took the activist side of Marx rather than taking the philosophical side of him. Rosa Luxemburg founded Social Democratic Party in Poland, and she is a Marxist and economic theorist. Luxemburg is popular for her theory on mass line to encourage mass strikes. He opines that wage slavery continues to suffer even after its expansion of suffrage. This is due to still existing workers' alienation from means of production and capital. Antonio Gramsci in Italy is another Marxist. and founded Communist Party of Italy during the fascist period in Italy. Despite his persistent illness, imprisonment for his journalistic literature against him, he continued to write even in prison. Gramsci contends that it is necessary to reform the concept of man, for humanity is reflecting in three levels: the individual, the other men and thought, and the natural world. Further, the human right is not state-centered but society-centered. Gramsci propounds that passive revolution has another dimension called molecular transformation. But to him, rather than molecular transformation, an end of domination is significant. Further, he feels the need for a critique of the major structures, namely state and civil society, with which human being can realize his full potential. We are still living in times of economic class as politically dominant, however democratic our nations are. Today's globalized world not simply facilitates communication but facilitates free trade and corporate culture where petty vendors are at stake. In the name of liberal democracy, rights are disproportionately distributed, and this needs to be questioned. The term liberty and right to private property should not be understood in loose sense. Rights are inclusive of duties and social responsibilities. For example, corporate social responsibility of recent times is a mandatory that involves the capitalistic groups of society to share their wealth for the well-being of the deprived groups. This is recently incorporated in the Indian Constitution too. Further, employee welfare schemes and organized trade unions and other unions are the resultants of rectifications done by liberal democracies due to the influence of Marxist movements. Nations are taking actively developmental initiatives, if not in Marxian sense, through a complete state ownership, but in socialist, secular, and democratic constitutions. Friends, we started this module with how feudalism and industrial development excluded the agricultural and industrial workers from complete development. It was Marx who identified the exploitation and made the world to know the flaws of capitalist societies. By the end of this lesson, we find Marx's idealistic society and his views on anticipated revolution in the dialectical process of development, which subsequently influenced many nations. Also influenced globally to replace liberal democratic nations into socialistic democracies. However, one needs to relook into the prospects and consequences of both democracies, liberal and socialistic, in the current day challenges. Friends, with this we come to an end of this unit. I thank you for your engaged listening and patience.